It was late October 2019 when I decided to finally start building the small off-grid cabin I had been thinking about for years. I was 32 at the time and had just left a job I hated, the kind that drains you slowly and doesn't even pay well enough to make the stress feel worth it. I didn't have much in savings, but I had just enough to buy some land and basic supplies. I found a patch of land for cheap in a remote part of northern Oregon, about a 2-hour drive from any major town. It was forested, sloped, and wild. There were no neighbors within a mile, maybe more, and no cell signal unless I walked a quarter mile up the hill. That was fine with me. I needed a break from people. The plan was to live in my truck camper while I slowly built a one-room cabin. Nothing fancy, just 4 walls, a slanted roof, a wood stove, and enough insulation to survive the winter. I didn't want to wait until spring. I was sick of putting things off. I figured I'd build a basic frame and get a roof up fast, then finish the inside slowly, piece by piece. That first week on the land, the weather was kind, cool, dry, and calm. I spent my days clearing a flat patch for the foundation, chopping down saplings and moving rocks. I brought in some gravel with the help of an old flatbed trailer I borrowed from a guy I knew back in Salem. By the 4th day, I had my base skids leveled and pressure treated. I slept like a rock at night, tired from honest work. On the 6th day, the weather started to change. It started drizzling around noon, but I kept working through it, laying the first floor joists. I had a big tarp over the whole area, tied to nearby trees and poles, so the rain didn't slow me down much. That night, though, I barely slept. The wind picked up hard after dark, and the tarp flapped and snapped above me like a loose sail. I was in the truck, wrapped in a sleeping bag, listening to the storm build. Rain tapped against the metal like a constant whisper, and every now and then, a stronger gust would make the truck rock a bit. I told myself it was just weather, that's all. The next morning, I found the tarp ripped in 2 places and one of the joists soaked from the water that had pooled on top. I spent half the day redoing the tarp setup, using bungee cords, ratchet straps, and even a few ropes with truckers' knots to keep it tighter. It was frustrating and I was getting behind schedule. Still, I had no plans of giving up. If anything, I was more determined. I wanted this place to be mine, something I built with my own hands, even if it was small. The following night, it rained harder. I lay awake again, listening to the storm. It wasn't just the noise keeping me up this time. Something felt off. I don't mean supernatural, just a kind of tension in the air, like I wasn't alone anymore. It was probably just my nerves from being isolated and tired, but I remember holding my breath a few times, convinced I'd heard something move outside. At first light, I got out of the truck and walked around the clearing. Nothing looked disturbed, but I saw prints in the soft mud by the side of the truck. They were boot prints, not mine. Too narrow, lighter, not deep like mine were. I crouched down and stared at them for a long time, my heart suddenly racing in a way that didn't make any sense. I hadn't seen anyone in over a week. No cars.
No hunters.
No signs of hikers. The access road was rough enough that most people wouldn't bother trying unless they had a serious 4x4. I kept telling myself maybe they were mine. Maybe I just didn't remember stepping there. But the angle of them didn't match how I normally walked around the truck. One print was half on a flat stone, and I knew I never stepped on that rock. I would have slipped. I spent that day building fast. I didn't even eat lunch. I got the subfloor down and started lifting up the wall frames. I kept stopping to listen. Every time a branch snapped somewhere off in the trees, I froze. The sound of dripping water off the leaves made me jump. I knew I was getting paranoid. That's what the mind does when you're alone too long. But still, the boot prints were real. By the time the sky darkened again, I had all 4 walls up and braced, and I tossed the tarp back over everything. It wasn't perfect, but it kept the wood dry enough. I climbed back into the truck, wiped my wet boots clean, and sat inside with my flashlight and a protein bar. I was too wired to eat properly. I listened again. The wind had died down. Rain fell steady, soft but endless. That sound used to comfort me. It didn't anymore. Around midnight, something clunked. It was dull and solid, not metal on metal like something hitting the truck. More like wood. I sat up, holding my breath again, staring out the window. Nothing, just trees and shadows. Then another sound, closer to a scrape this time. I turned off the flashlight and let my eyes adjust. The cabin frame was right in front of the truck, about 30 feet ahead. My headlights had been off all night, and I didn't want to turn them on now and give away my position, in case someone really was out there. I sat still for probably half an hour, barely blinking. The sound didn't come again. I told myself it could have been the wind shifting something, maybe the tarp dragging, but I couldn't let it go. I opened the truck door as quietly as I could and stepped out, holding the little hatchet I kept under the seat. The rain soaked me instantly. I moved slow, crouched low, and circled toward the frame. I didn't see anyone. Nothing looked touched. The tarp hadn't moved. Still, I walked around the structure once, checking everything. The only new thing I noticed was a crushed energy drink can lying in the dirt near the backside. Not mine. I didn't drink that brand. I picked it up, feeling a rush of heat crawl up my neck. I threw it back down and walked fast to the edge of the trees with my flashlight. I scanned the forest. No movement, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. Maybe still was. Back in the truck, I locked all the doors and left the hatchet in my lap. I stayed awake until dawn. My head ached from tension. When the gray light came, I finally stepped back out, shaking and tired. It had stopped raining, but the whole clearing was soaked. Mud sucked at my boots with each step. I didn't feel like building that day, but I forced myself to start the roof frame. I worked in silence, ears always tuned to the woods. By mid-afternoon, I spotted something that stopped me cold. Tucked between two trees about 50 yards away, I saw a piece of reflective orange. I climbed down from the ladder and walked slowly that direction, holding the hatchet again. It was an old hunter's marker, tied to a branch with fading paracord. But just below it, nailed into the trunk of the tree, was something I hadn't seen before. It was a wooden stake with a strip of red cloth on it. Fresh, new, no mold. It hadn't been there days ago. I turned and scanned the woods again. Nothing, no sound, but someone had marked that tree. Why? I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave, just get out of there and try again next spring. But another part of me, the stubborn, angry part, wanted to stay, wanted to finish what I started. I went back to the frame and kept working. That night, it rained harder than ever. Thunder rolled far away but never fully reached me. It was the kind of downpour that made everything echo. I stayed in the truck again, trying not to flinch at every snapping branch or clattering drop. Sometime after midnight, I swore I heard a footstep, then another, just two right outside. I held my breath for so long my chest hurt. I didn't move. The sound didn't come again. I waited. I don't know how long. Eventually, I passed out from exhaustion. The next morning, the mud around the truck was churned up again. Same narrow boots. More prints. They circled halfway around, then vanished into the trees. That was it. I made a decision. I spent the next 2 days working like a maniac. I got the roof up. I covered it in tar paper. I nailed up half the siding. It didn't matter if it looked good. I just needed it closed in. Somewhere to lock. Somewhere to hide. The last night before I planned to move my things inside, I stayed up one more time in the truck. It rained again, softer this time, but I didn't sleep. At one point, I heard a single tap on the roof of the truck. Not a drop, not a branch. Tap. I grabbed the hatchet and threw open the door, ready to fight. No one there. but something lay on the hood of the truck. A strip of red cloth. I backed away slow, heart in my throat. I scanned the trees again. I couldn't see anyone, but I knew now, without question, someone had been out there, watching, waiting. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. The next morning, I moved everything into the cabin. I screwed a bar across the inside of the door and boarded the one window shut. I stayed 2 more nights inside that half-finished shell, sitting awake most of the time, clutching the hatchet. On the 3rd night, I heard nothing. No movement.
No tapping.
Nothing but rain. By the end of the week, I drove back to town. I didn't sell the land. I didn't quit the project. But I changed the locks. I brought a trail cam next time, and a shotgun. I never figured out who was out there. Maybe just some local trying to scare me off. Maybe someone living in the woods. But I built the cabin anyway, and I never slept easy there again. My name's Eric Whalen. This happened in 2018. I was 29. I'd taken time off after getting laid off from a landscaping company in Flagstaff. I wasn't really the type to sit at home and stew in my own thoughts, so I decided to drive out to northeastern Arizona and spend some time away from people. I had a cheap SUV, a couple hundred in savings, and a friend who had a small hunting cabin about 40 minutes outside Chinle, near the edges of the Navajo Nation lands. The cabin wasn't anything special. No electricity, no plumbing, just a wood structure with a tin roof, a little propane stove, a cot, and a small rainwater tank that trickled into a steel basin. I didn't mind roughing it. I brought a cooler, some water jugs, a sleeping bag, canned food, a hatchet, and a .38 revolver that I barely ever used. I'd driven up that way a couple times with my old buddy Logan during deer season. We'd seen mountain lions in the area, even some old bear tracks once, but nothing worse than that. I figured I'd spend 5 or 6 nights there, clear my head, maybe hike a little, take pictures, write in a cheap journal I'd started using to kill time. But the trip didn't go like that. Started strange, and it got worse. The cabin sat in a patch of scrub pine, with a flat stretch of land around it that dropped off into a deep wash about 100 yards out. Beyond that were low sandstone ridges. On the first day, the weather was dry and cold.
No clouds.
Just wind now and then. I got there around 2 p.m., opened the old padlock, and swept out the inside. Logan hadn't used it in years, but nothing seemed broken. It smelled musty, the way sealed cabins always do. I checked the area around the cabin. Some old beer cans, a few cigarette butts in a tin can, probably left by some hikers or ranchers. Nothing fresh. I unloaded my stuff, pulled the cot out under the little overhang in the back to get air, and set up my cooler with bungee cords so raccoons wouldn't get into it. That night was fine. Cold, but nothing strange. The wind made the walls creak. I slept with my gun under the edge of my sleeping bag just because I always do that in remote areas. It was the second night things started to feel off. I'd gone on a long walk earlier that afternoon. I followed the edge of the wash and crossed it where some boulders narrowed it into a chute. There were old cow bones there, clean and scattered. Looked like coyotes had been at them. I climbed up into a low rocky ridge and sat for a while looking at the horizon. I didn't see anyone, not a soul. When I got back, it was close to sundown. I made some food, a can of beans with cut-up sausage heated in a pot, and watched the sky go dark. That part of Arizona gets black at night. No cities nearby, just stars and cold air. I had a lantern going inside the cabin and was writing in my notebook when I heard a sound. Footsteps. They were soft, maybe 30 feet out, behind the cabin near the treeline. I froze and turned off the lantern. The footsteps stopped. I waited maybe 2 or 3 minutes, gun in hand, listening through the wall. Nothing. Then I heard something sharp. Not loud, like a sniff. A really dry, raspy kind of sniff, the kind a dog makes when it's trying to pick up a scent. I waited another minute and went outside. Nothing, just dirt, brush, wind. I walked the perimeter with my flashlight.
No prints.
No animals. I told myself it was probably a javelina or even a mule deer, and they'd bolted as soon as I moved. I tried to shake it off and go back to writing, but I couldn't focus. I kept listening, kept thinking about that sniff. I didn't sleep much that night. I heard nothing else, but the silence was heavy. The next morning, I checked around the cabin again.
No prints. No scat.
Nothing fresh. I didn't want to scare myself out of staying, so I told myself I just imagined it. Maybe wind against the brush or a stray coyote. That day, I hiked in a different direction, up along the dry ridges to the south. Found some caves, shallow ones, and a small creek bed that had just a trickle of water in it. I followed it upstream and found some hoof prints, maybe elk, but they were a few days old. The thing that stuck with me was this one tree, a juniper, that had what looked like scratches down the side of it. Claw marks. Could have been an animal marking its territory, but they were long and wide. Not a cat, not a dog, and not deep enough for a bear. That bugged me more than I admitted to myself. I got back late, right as the sun went down, and that's when things started really going sideways. There was a dead bird in front of the cabin door. A raven, I think. Neck twisted, wings half open. Looked like it had been dropped there. No blood, just limp and broken. I didn't like that. It was too on the nose, too deliberate. I walked in circles, scanning the hills, the trees, the wash. Nothing, no sound, no movement. I used a stick to fling the bird off the porch and went inside. That night I didn't cook, just ate crackers and jerky inside. I pulled the cot in, locked the door, and kept the lantern off. I lay in my sleeping bag and stared at the ceiling for hours. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slower this time, closer, on the gravel maybe 10, 12 feet from the wall. Then breathing, not heavy, not wheezy, just steady and dry like someone standing still, waiting. I didn't move, didn't even reach for the gun at first. I just lay there, cold sweat soaking my back, heart pounding. The breathing went on for maybe 30 seconds, and then something tapped the wall. Just one time, a light tap. I bolted up, grabbed the gun, and shouted without thinking. But I didn't hear anyone run, didn't hear movement at all. I waited 10 minutes, then opened the door fast with the gun out. The flashlight beam swept the yard. Nothing. I couldn't sleep after that. Just sat there until dawn, lantern low, watching the windows, listening. The next day, I decided to leave. I packed everything up, fast, barely ate. I didn't care about finishing my trip anymore. Something was off. I couldn't explain it, but it was there. I strapped the cooler, loaded the cot, and was getting ready to lock the cabin when I realized the padlock was missing. Just gone. The metal loop was still there, but the actual lock was gone. I hadn't noticed it last night. I always kept it hanging open on the loop when I was inside. I thought maybe I left it in my bag or something, but I tore everything apart and didn't find it. I didn't want to wait around. I locked the cabin with a spare and started the SUV. That's when the battery light came on, then the check engine light. Then the whole dashboard went black and the engine died. I tried it again. Nothing. The battery wasn't that old. I'd driven over 200 miles the day before without a hiccup. Now it was dead. The nearest town was miles away and no cell service. I could hike out, but it'd take hours and it was already noon. I gave myself one more night, just one. I'd leave at sunrise and hike until I got signal. I didn't want to. Every instinct told me not to, but I didn't have a choice, so I stayed. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat inside with the lantern off and the gun across my lap. It was maybe 1:20 a.m. when I saw the shape. There was a sliver of moonlight, just enough to see movement through the side window. A figure, just outside, not walking, not moving side to side, just standing there, still as stone. I crouched low and moved quietly to the far wall. No sound, no movement, just that feeling that something was watching. I waited a full 15 minutes. Then I stood up fast and flashed the beam of my light through the window. Empty, but there were tracks. I saw them the next morning. Footprints.
Bora.
Human. All around the cabin, circling it.
Nos chus.
Just rough toes, deep heel marks. Whoever it was had walked through dry thorn brush and cactus with no protection. That made my stomach turn. I couldn't make sense of it. What kind of person wanders barefoot through desert country in the middle of the night, leaving dead animals, tapping on walls? I didn't stay another second. I hiked all morning, got cell signal by late afternoon, just enough to call a tow. A friend in Winslow came to get me. When we returned for the SUV 3 days later, the tow guy, a Navajo man named Desmond, took one look at the cabin and refused to go near it. He didn't say why, didn't explain, just stood at the edge of the clearing and waited with his arms crossed. He helped me get the SUV hooked up. Engine was completely dead. Battery was torn loose, wires pulled out. Not chewed, pulled. When we were driving back, he finally said something. Quiet, like he didn't want to talk about it. He said I shouldn't come out to places like that alone. Not unless I knew how to look. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know. I've never been back to that cabin. Logan told me he tore it down the year after. Said some local kids had broken in and trashed it. But I don't think it was kids. I think there was someone out there. Someone who wasn't quite right. Maybe not right in the head. Maybe something worse. Someone who'd been living in those hills too long. Without shoes, without language, without anything. Watching, waiting, testing how close they could get. People talk about skinwalkers like they're witches or monsters. But I think the real thing is worse because it's real. Someone who's forgotten what being human even means, who lives in the skin but not in the mind. I try not to think about it now, but sometimes when I'm alone, walking a trail, I'll hear a rustle behind me, a breath, a footstep, and I remember that cabin, and the dead bird, and those bare feet circling me in the dark. And I keep walking, always looking back, just in case. It was the fall of 2021 when I finally made the decision to take some time off and head north to a remote part of Minnesota, close to the Canadian border. I was 34 back then, just getting out of a long and rough patch in my life. My marriage had ended the previous winter, and I was still sorting through the pieces. I hadn't been feeling like myself for a long time, and I figured being alone in the woods might help clear my head a little. I'd always wanted to try building something with my hands anyway, so I thought I'd spend a few weeks setting up a basic hunting cabin on some land I inherited from my uncle years ago. It was wild, untouched land, dense with pine and birch, with an old gravel trail running halfway through the property. I brought my dog with me, of course. Boone was a black lab I'd had since he was a pup. He was 10 years old, but still strong, still full of energy. He always knew when I was packing for a trip and started pacing with excitement as soon as he saw the gear come out. That morning, we loaded up the truck. A beat-up 2012 Silverado with a bed full of tools, planks, tarps, nails, and just enough food and water to last a couple of weeks. I packed light but smart. The plan was to build something small, just a one-room cabin I could sleep in and stay dry inside. Nothing fancy, no power, no plumbing, just walls, a roof, a cot, and peace. We arrived late afternoon. Took about 6 hours to get up there from Duluth. The sky was already overcast when we pulled off the gravel trail and found the little clearing I'd marked months ago on an old paper map. The place was quiet, just the wind pushing through the trees and a few crows in the distance. I parked the truck, stepped out, stretched my legs, and Boone jumped down right after me. He sniffed the air, wagged his tail, and then trotted off to check the perimeter like he always did. He had this habit of walking the edge of a new place, kind of like he was setting invisible boundaries. I let him do his thing while I unloaded the gear. That first night was calm. I pitched a small tent under a thick pine tree, ate a can of beans, and lay there beside Boone listening to the forest. I was so far from anything that even the airplanes didn't fly overhead out there. Just silence and the occasional rustling of branches or a distant owl. Boone curled up next to me, his breathing slow and steady, and I drifted off. Over the next few days, I got to work on the cabin. I had no blueprint, just a simple idea in my head. I cleared more space, dug post holes, and began raising the frame. It was hard work, especially doing it alone, but I liked it. Kept my hands busy and my mind quiet. Boone stayed close, either dozing in the dirt or patrolling the edge of the trees. Every now and then he'd bark at something in the distance, probably a deer or a squirrel, but he always came back calm. We settled into a routine, but then things started feeling off. It began on the 6th night. I just crawled into the tent, muscles aching, when Boone suddenly sat up stiff and alert. His ears perked forward, his body tensed like a coiled spring. I followed his eyes toward the dark tree line, but I couldn't see anything. Still, Boone didn't relax. He let out this low growl, not aggressive, just cautious, and didn't lie back down for almost an hour. He just sat there watching the woods. I told myself maybe it was a bear or a wolf wandering through, and Boone was just doing what dogs do. But the way he stayed frozen like that, it made the hair on my arms stand up. The next morning, I found something odd. About 30 feet from the tent, just past the edge of the clearing, I noticed deep footprints in the soft ground. Not boot prints, bare feet. Wide, rough, and human. I stood there for a long while, just staring at them. There were 5 prints, all spaced like someone had been walking slow, maybe watching from the woods. I looked around, called out, but of course there was no answer. Boone sniffed the area and growled again, low and uneasy. I spent the rest of that day with my axe a little closer than usual. I kept working. I tried not to let it bother me, but that night I didn't sleep well. Boone paced around the tent, stopping often to look out into the trees. His body language said it all. He was uneasy, and when Boone was uneasy, I knew better than to ignore it. 2 days later, I finished putting the roof on the cabin. It wasn't pretty, but it was sturdy. I moved my gear inside and rolled out my sleeping pad in the corner. There was still a lot to do. Insulation, flooring, ceiling, but it was livable for now. That night it rained hard. The wind picked up, trees swayed, and the tarp flapped until I finally secured it better. Inside, Boone stayed close. I could tell he didn't like the sound of the storm. Neither did I. Something about it made the place feel tighter, more closed in. And then, sometime around midnight, Boone barked. Not a warning bark. A real, sharp, loud bark that echoed through the trees like a crack. I sat up fast, heart pounding, and grabbed my flashlight. Boone was standing at the door, hackles up, tail stiff. I opened the door a crack and shined the light out into the dark. I didn't see anything at first, but then, maybe 40 feet out, just past a pine tree, I caught the faintest glimpse of movement. A shadow, tall and thin, just standing there, not moving, watching. The beam from my flashlight was shaky, and the rain made it hard to see, but I know I saw someone. Whoever it was, they didn't speak, didn't run, just stood there. I slammed the door shut, grabbed my rifle, and kept it close the rest of the night. The next morning, they were gone. No footprints this time, just wet ground and a heavy silence in the air. Boone sniffed around but didn't go far. I considered leaving that day, but something stubborn in me said no. This was my land. My cabin. I wasn't going to be chased off by some nutcase wandering around the woods. Still, I made changes. I moved the truck closer to the cabin, kept the rifle loaded. I even set up a small tripwire with empty cans around the edge of the clearing. It wasn't much, but at least I'd hear if someone came close again. That night, it was quiet. Too quiet. The rain had stopped, but the air felt heavy. Boone didn't bark, didn't growl. He just stayed pressed against my side all night, awake with his ears twitching at every small sound. I didn't sleep either. I don't remember when I finally dozed off, but I remember what I saw when I woke up. The cans had been knocked over. All of them, not just one or two, every single one was down. I stepped outside, heart pounding in my chest. The ground was covered in fresh prints again. Bare feet moving in a circle around the cabin, stopping by the windows, the door, the truck. The person had been walking slow. They weren't trying to break in, they were just looking, watching. Boone ran out barking, teeth bared, and darted into the woods, following a scent. I called him back, but he was gone for a few minutes. When he came back, he was shaking, not scared, but tense. Whatever he saw out there, he didn't like it. I packed my gear. I'd had enough. The cabin was built. I could finish the inside later. I just wanted out of there, but I couldn't leave. The truck tires were slashed. All 4 of them. Not punctured, slashed. Long, deep cuts along the rubber. Whoever had been watching wasn't just passing by. They didn't want me to leave. That was the first time I felt real fear. The kind that grabs your spine and squeezes. I didn't have cell service. I was too far north. The closest town was almost 20 miles of thick forest away. I had food, water, and a gun, but now I was stuck, trapped. Boone sat by the door, eyes fixed on the woods. We stayed inside all day. I barely moved. Boone didn't either. He just watched. That night, the cans didn't rattle. But in the morning, I found something new. Hanging from a tree branch just outside the cabin was a rabbit. Gutted, skinned, tied up with old, stained rope. It wasn't Boone's kill. He doesn't do that kind of thing. This was human. It had been placed there deliberately, like some kind of message. I didn't sleep that night. Every time a branch cracked or the wind shifted, I thought someone was coming through the trees. I kept the rifle close. Kept Boone even closer. At some point around 3 in the morning, I saw movement again, just outside the cabin. I didn't turn on the flashlight this time. I didn't move. I just listened. I heard breathing, heavy, slow breathing. Not Boone's, not mine. Then footsteps, bare feet on wet leaves. Then silence. I didn't sleep again after that. At sunrise, I took a backpack with food, filled a few bottles of water, and grabbed a compass. I couldn't stay any longer. Tires or not, I had to try. I locked the cabin door behind me, shouldered my rifle, and headed south with Boone by my side. We hiked all day. My legs ached. My throat was dry, but we didn't stop. By late evening, I found a service road, and not long after that, I found help. I didn't go back. I hired someone to go pick up the truck a week later. The cabin is still out there, I guess, still standing, but I haven't returned since, and I never found out who was watching me, or why. I rented a cabin up in the mountains of Montana in December of 2019. I was 31 back then, burned out from the long hours I'd been putting in at my IT job in Salt Lake City. I didn't care for much company, and by that point I was looking for a place where I could shut off completely for a while. No phone, no emails, no noise. I wanted to wake up to snow and trees, not sirens and notifications. So, I looked up a few off-grid rentals and found this small log cabin about 2.5 hours north of Missoula, a few miles off the main highway, past a little unincorporated town I'd never heard of. The cabin was surrounded by forest, Tall pine trees stood heavy with snow, and from what I could see on the online map, there were no neighbors nearby, just miles of mountain wilderness. I booked it for 10 days, thinking it would be the reset I needed. I packed my truck with supplies: water, food, a few propane canisters, a portable solar charger, extra batteries, my camping stove, and winter gear. When I got there, it was even more isolated than I expected. The driveway was just a narrow trail that wound through the trees, and I almost missed it. The cabin itself looked like it hadn't been lived in for a long time. The wood was weathered, and snow had gathered heavily on the roof. It had no electricity, no running water, and no internet. The guy who owned it left a note in a metal box nailed to a post. Just some instructions about how to get the small propane heater running, where the compost toilet was, and a few warnings about wildlife, especially bears. The first few days went by fine. I read books during the day, cooked simple meals on the stove, hiked a little in the afternoons when it wasn't snowing, and slept early. At night, it was quiet in a way that city people don't understand. The kind of quiet where you can hear your own heartbeat if you stay still long enough. I'd sometimes hear the trees creaking under the weight of snow or a distant snap from a branch falling. I was alone, but I didn't mind it. On the 5th night, I woke up because I heard something moving outside. It was almost 3:30 in the morning. I checked my watch and sat still in the sleeping bag. The sound was soft, like crunching snow, slow footsteps. I thought maybe it was a deer or maybe even a moose. Those weren't uncommon in that area. I reached for my flashlight but didn't turn it on yet. I just waited, listening. The footsteps stopped outside the cabin, maybe 10 or 15 feet from the front wall. That's when I felt a little uneasy. I stayed completely quiet and waited to hear more. Then I heard what sounded like breathing, slow, controlled breathing. Not animal-like, steady, like someone trying to stay calm. I turned on the flashlight and aimed it toward the window, but the frost had built up so thick I couldn't see out clearly. I didn't want to open the door to check, so I waited. After a minute, the breathing faded. No more footsteps, nothing. I didn't sleep again that night. By morning, I convinced myself it was probably an animal and I was just imagining the rest. But I went outside anyway, just to check. I walked around the cabin and saw the tracks, footprints in boots, not hooves or paws. They circled the entire cabin once, stopping near the front window, then backtracked down the trail into the woods. They weren't mine. I stood staring at them for a long time, thinking. I had been here 5 days. No one was supposed to be out this far. There were no other cabins or homes nearby. I knew that because I checked the map and asked the owner. I followed the tracks a little way into the woods but stopped after maybe 60 yards. They went further and then veered off. I didn't feel right being too far from the cabin without my gear. That day, I chopped more wood and moved the rest of my supplies inside. I triple-checked the lock on the door even though it was just a metal latch. I considered packing up and leaving, but I still had enough food and gas, and I thought maybe it was a hunter or hiker who got lost. That night, I stayed awake longer, sitting with my flashlight in hand and a hunting knife I had brought for food prep. I felt stupid holding it, but I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., I heard something again, this time from the back of the cabin. It was faint at first, like someone brushing past the wall. Then I heard something more distinct, a soft thud, like someone had pressed their hand against the outside. I didn't move. I just listened. My breathing slowed so much I thought I might pass out. Another thud, then nothing. After 10 minutes, I grabbed my flashlight and opened the back door a few inches. I shined the beam out quickly. Nothing, just trees and white snow. I didn't see tracks this time, but the wind had picked up earlier and might have covered them. I shut the door and pushed the small wooden table in front of it. I felt paranoid, but I didn't care. The next day, I tried to call the cabin owner on my satellite phone, but the reception was poor and it didn't go through. I tried again an hour later, still nothing. I left a message just in case, saying that someone might have come near the cabin at night. I didn't hear back. That afternoon, I found something else. I was checking the tree line behind the cabin, maybe 50 feet out, and saw something half buried in snow near a stump. I walked over, brushed the snow off, and saw a small black backpack. The zipper was partially open. Inside was a rolled-up tarp, a pocket knife, a lighter, a plastic water bottle, and a pair of socks.
No wallet.
No ID. I didn't touch anything else. I just zipped it back and carried it inside. I kept it by the door in case someone came looking for it. But nobody did. That night was worse. Around 1 a.m., I heard the footsteps again. Not cautious this time. Quicker. More deliberate. They circled the cabin faster, and then came to a stop at the back door. I sat in complete silence. No light, just waiting. I heard the latch on the back door rattle. Not loud, but it moved. Someone was testing it. Then again. A pause. Then nothing. The wind blew outside. The trees shifted, but no more sounds came. I stayed awake until the sky started turning lighter. As soon as there was enough light, I stepped outside with my flashlight still on. Fresh prints again.
Boot prints.
They were clear this time, leading straight to the door, then around the cabin once and gone. That was enough for me. I packed everything by noon. Took me a couple hours to get it all in the truck. I made sure the cabin was locked up, even though it didn't matter much out there. As I drove back toward the main road, I kept checking the rear view. There was nothing, just the trees getting smaller in the mirror. I made it back to Missoula that evening. I tried the cabin owner again and left another message. No reply. A week later, I got a call from a sheriff's deputy. He had gotten my number from the cabin owner, who finally returned. They wanted to ask about the backpack I found. I told him exactly where I'd found it and what was inside. He didn't say much, just that they'd send someone to retrieve it. A month passed, and then I saw a news article. It was a short piece buried deep online about a missing man named Kyle Henderson, hiker, age 42, last seen around the western Montana forests that December. They found a body nearly a mile from the area where I had stayed. It was frozen, partially buried. No signs of trauma. Looked like exposure. He had no gear with him. No food, no supplies. Just boots, gloves, and a coat. He wasn't dressed to survive out there. The backpack matched his. I don't know why he was out there. I don't know if he was the one walking around my cabin. Maybe he got disoriented, and I was just the closest shelter he could find. But if he was in trouble, why didn't he knock? Why didn't he call out? Why walk circles around my cabin in the dark? I've thought about that trip a lot since then, about how quiet those nights were, and how close someone was standing on the other side of the wall while I tried to keep my breathing steady. I still go out into the woods sometimes, but I don't rent isolated cabins anymore. I bring people with me now, and I always check for tracks in the snow. It was the spring of 2017 when I booked that small farm cabin in rural Missouri. I was 34 at the time, single, no kids, no one to worry about but myself. I lived in St. Louis back then, working in IT, dealing with constant stress, phone calls, and noise from upstairs neighbors who always seemed to be moving furniture at 2 a.m. I needed quiet, not a vacation to a city. I wanted something silent, still, and alone. I found the place online, listed as a remote farm stay with full privacy. It was about 2 hours southwest of the city. The photos showed a tiny wooden cabin sitting on the edge of a soybean field, a little porch, a fire pit, and an old red barn behind a fence line. There were a couple of cows in the background, and that was it. It was exactly what I wanted. Peace, stillness. I packed some clothes, loaded my Jeep with food, firewood, some books, and an old .22 rifle I used for plinking cans, just for fun. The listing said there were coyotes in the area, so I figured it wouldn't hurt to bring it along. The drive was quiet. I remember stopping in a small town, forgot the name of it, for gas and a sandwich. I didn't see more than 3 or 4 people, and nobody looked up from their own world. Just the way I liked it. I arrived around 4:30 p.m. There was a long gravel road that cut between fields, wide and flat. The main house was barely visible behind a grove of trees about a quarter mile from the cabin. The owner, a man named Wayne, had left the key in a lockbox, and I never met him in person, which was fine by me. The cabin was smaller than I expected. 1 room, a bed, a wood stove, a little kitchenette, and a bathroom with a chemical toilet. Everything smelled like cedar and old dust, but it felt good to be there. It was dead quiet. No traffic, no sirens, just wind moving through dry grass. The cabin faced west, so the sun dipped low across the fields and lit the room with a deep golden color as I unpacked. Behind the cabin was the barn, bigger than the photos made it seem. Old wooden, painted red years ago, but now mostly peeled and gray. It sat across a wire fence with 2 sagging gates. I didn't plan on going near it. It wasn't part of the rental. I figured it was just storage. There were 2 cows I could see grazing at the far side of the field, black and slow, heads always down. Near them was a shed like a lean-to, and that was about the only man-made structure besides the cabin and barn. My first night was peaceful. I started a fire in the pit, grilled some hot dogs, and read a few chapters from a book I'd brought. I fell asleep before 10 p.m. The next morning, I stepped outside around 7 a.m. with my coffee. It was cool and foggy. I noticed movement out near the barn. A man, I assumed Wayne, was walking toward the cows, carrying a bucket in one hand and something long in the other, probably a stick or cattle prod. He didn't wave or look at me. He just moved slow, almost heavy, like he was sore or stiff. I watched him for a minute, then turned back inside. That day, I sat on the porch most of the time, just enjoying how quiet everything was. Around 2 p.m., I went walking through the field for a bit, keeping to the edge. The ground was soft but dry. I shot a few cans I'd brought, just plinking at a fallen log near the treeline. I didn't see any wildlife, no rabbits, no birds, just wind. When I got back, the man was back near the barn. He stood there, facing it, not moving. He was there for a long time. Then he walked behind it and out of view. That was it. That night I noticed something odd. Around 11:30 p.m., I heard movement outside. Not animals. It sounded like footsteps in dry grass. Slow, dragging steps. I turned off the lamp and peeked out the curtain, expecting to see someone. But it was empty. I stood there for 5 minutes, heart beating faster than it should have. But nothing. I finally got back in bed. The next morning, I saw the same man again. This time he was standing still in the same exact spot near the cows, not moving. I watched him through binoculars. He wasn't feeding them, just standing. Then he crouched for a while, then stood back up and walked toward the barn. His movements were slow, almost mechanical. I figured he was just an old man, probably dealing with arthritis or something. But there was something about the pattern. He always moved the same way, same path, same crouch.
No veriascen.
On the 3rd night, I was woken up around 2 a.m. by the sound of something tapping. Light, quick taps. It was coming from the window by the front door. I stayed in bed, holding my breath. Then the tapping stopped. I got up and checked. Nothing. I stepped outside with my flashlight and swept the beam across the yard and toward the barn. I saw nothing. But when I walked around the side of the cabin, I saw something weird in the dirt. A trail. A straight, narrow path of compressed grass that led from the barn fence to the cabin, stopping at the porch steps. I followed it with my light. The grass had been flattened in a way that suggested someone had walked it over and over. Same path, same direction, always ending at my porch. I didn't sleep much after that. The next day, I called the number Wayne left on the welcome sheet just to check in. I didn't get a response, just rang twice and went to voicemail. I left a message asking if he had been out tending to the cows and if he needed anything from the cabin. No call back. On the 5th day, curiosity got the better of me. Around noon, I decided to check the barn out. I wasn't planning on going inside, just close enough to maybe understand what that man was doing. The wire fence was easy to step over. The cows were at the far end again. They barely moved. The barn smelled like mold and dirt. There was a door hanging off one hinge, and inside it was dark. I didn't go in, but I peeked. There were shovels, sacks of grain, an old wheelbarrow, and something wrapped in blue tarp near the back wall. I thought maybe it was hay or supplies, but it was shaped odd, like a bench or something long and narrow. I left without touching anything. On my way back to the cabin, I noticed the man again. He was near the tree line now, kneeling, facing away from me. It wasn't clear what he was doing, but his back was to me the whole time. Then I saw a second shape, another person, also crouching. I froze. There hadn't been anyone else on this land the entire time. They didn't move. I stared for minutes, then walked quickly back to the cabin and locked the door. When I looked again with binoculars, they were gone. The next morning, I saw footprints around the fire pit. Not mine, not boots like mine either. Barefoot, human, wide, flat, and with thick heels. There were at least 4 sets. They circled the pit, then veered toward the window. My stomach dropped. That explained the tapping. I packed my bag right then. I wanted to leave. I didn't care that I had another 2 nights left. But when I tried to start my Jeep, the engine turned once and died. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood. The battery cables were loose, both of them. Not by accident. The clamps had been unscrewed. I hadn't touched them. I didn't have tools, so I tightened them with my fingers as best I could. After 15 minutes, the engine finally turned over. I drove down the gravel road and didn't stop until I hit the main highway. I found a gas station with signal and called Wayne again. This time someone answered, but it wasn't Wayne. The voice that answered was younger, sounded like a guy in his 20s. I asked if it was Wayne's number. The guy said no. Wayne's been dead 4 years. I hung up. I sat there for 10 minutes, just staring at the phone. My hands were cold. I could feel the sweat on my back under my shirt. I called back, and the guy picked up again. I asked who was living on the farm. He said nobody. The land had been sold to a company that never followed through on development. The cabin was still there, but nobody was supposed to be renting it. I checked the website I had used. The listing was gone. I never told anyone what really happened, not even my brother. I told friends I cut my vacation short because of car trouble. That was easier than explaining something that didn't make sense. But I know what I saw. That same man doing the same walk. The crouching. The figures near the trees. The footprints. The barn. A few weeks later, I mailed a letter to the sheriff's office in the county where that farm was. I didn't leave my name. I just wrote what I saw and mentioned the strange activity. I don't know if they followed up. I've never gone back. And sometimes, even now, when I'm lying in bed in my apartment and the city is quiet for once, I think about that man walking slow across the field. How he never looked at me. How he did the same thing every day like a loop. And I wonder who he was, or what he was doing there, or if he's still out there walking those same lines in the dirt, waiting for someone else to rent that little cabin on the edge of the field. I took a seasonal job with the National Forest Service back in the fall of 2018, when I was 31. I had left my job in Phoenix after 10 years of sitting behind a desk and finally got sick of the fluorescent lights, the forced small talk, and the slow decay of everything inside me. I wanted to get away for a while, breathe some fresh air, maybe figure out what I actually wanted to do with my life. I applied to some remote postings around the country and ended up getting assigned to a small ranger district in the northern part of Utah, just outside a town called Pine Hollow. It was a quiet area, rugged mountains, a deep forest thick with pine and aspen, and not much else. The job mostly involved trail maintenance, fire watch, and checking on the old cabins and lookouts scattered throughout the forest. I was supposed to hike into a different location every few days and make sure everything was still in good shape. Most of these places hadn't been used in years and sat empty except for rodents and dust. I was fine with that. I didn't mind being alone. In fact, I preferred it. There was one cabin in particular that stood out to me on the maps, Rangers Post 117. It sat in a low valley surrounded by dense woods, about 12 miles from the closest service road. From what I read in the files, it hadn't been checked since 2012. The note said the road to it had been washed out, and no one had bothered to fix it because the area wasn't considered high priority anymore. But it was technically still Forest Service property, and since I was eager and stupid and looking to impress someone, I volunteered to go out there for a multi-day inspection. I left from the station with a heavy pack, tent, food, satellite radio, everything I thought I might need for a few days on foot. I hiked out early on a Tuesday morning, just as the sun was coming up. Took most of the day to reach the cabin. The forest got thicker the deeper I went, and by the time I was within a mile of Post 117, I had to leave the old trail and bushwhack. There wasn't even a trace of a path anymore. When I reached the cabin, it was nearly dusk. The place looked exactly like you'd expect an abandoned ranger outpost to look. Small, maybe 15 by 15 feet, with weathered siding, a slanted tin roof covered in pine needles, and a boarded-up front window. The door creaked when I pushed it open, and the inside smelled like mouse droppings and mold. There was an old stove in one corner, a cot in another, and a little desk under the window. Most of the furniture had been chewed on by rodents, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust. There was even an old map tacked to the wall with pins marking trails that hadn't existed in years. Instead of setting up my tent outside, I decided to clean the place up and sleep inside. I know that sounds dumb, but it had gotten colder than I expected, and the cabin was the only windbreak for miles. I swept out the worst of the filth with a broken broom, laid my sleeping bag on the cot, and boiled some water for a freeze-dried dinner. That night, the wind picked up. It whistled through cracks in the walls and made the whole cabin groan. I didn't sleep much. Around 2 or 3 a.m., I started hearing noises in the woods. Branches snapping, like something heavy was moving around out there. I told myself it was probably elk, or maybe a bear, but the sounds kept circling the cabin. Slow, deliberate, too slow for animals. I laid there, not moving, holding my breath. My heart thudded so loud I thought whatever was outside could hear it. By dawn, the sounds had stopped. I got up and went outside with my flashlight and bear spray. There weren't any clear tracks in the pine needles, just some matted down spots near the trees. I didn't like it, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it was elk after all. I spent the day taking notes on the structure, listing what needed repair, checking off boxes on a printed-out inspection form. The door was loose, the roof had rust holes, and some of the floorboards in the back were warped from water damage. I found an old logbook in a drawer with a few entries from 2006. The last one just said, "Snowed in, waiting it out." That was it. I thought about leaving that afternoon, packing up and hiking out before dark. But the idea of doing 12 miles overnight through that brush didn't sit right with me either. So I stayed one more night. That was the mistake. That night it rained hard. The sound of water on the tin roof made it hard to hear anything outside. I kept the little battery lantern on low next to the cot and sat up in my sleeping bag for a long time, staring at the door. It was warped and didn't close all the way, and I kept thinking about those sounds the night before. Around midnight, I got up to pee in the little clearing behind the cabin. I took my flashlight and stepped outside. The rain had turned to a light drizzle, and the forest was completely still, just wet and black and silent. I walked maybe 15 feet from the door, unzipped, and was about halfway through when I heard a branch break. Not far, maybe 10 feet into the tree line. I froze. Then another snap. I turned the flashlight toward the trees and waited. Nothing, just the beam lighting up wet branches. I zipped up and slowly backed toward the door. When I turned around, I saw that the door was wide open. I know I had closed it. I ran back inside, slammed it shut, and pushed my pack in front of it. I didn't sleep after that. I sat there with my back to the wall, holding the can of bear spray, listening for every little sound. When the sun finally came up, I shoved everything back in my pack, didn't even eat breakfast, and left. I didn't check the cabin again. I didn't bother leaving a note. I just wanted to get out of there, but it wasn't over. About 4 miles into the hike back, I stopped for water at a little creek. I crouched down to refill my bottle, and when I stood up, I saw something in the dirt across the water. Footprints.
Bore,
Human.
nos chus, no sacs.
Just a trail of prints in the mud, going parallel to the creek. They weren't old either. The rain from the night before hadn't washed them out. I followed them with my eyes, and they just ended right at a tree. No return path, like someone had stood there, watching the creek, and then vanished. I didn't stop again. I just kept walking. I was jumpy, kept turning around, thinking I heard something behind me, but the woods were quiet. By the time I got back to the station, it was nearly dark. I didn't tell anyone what happened. What could I say? That a door opened on its own and I found footprints? They would have thought I was tired, dehydrated, maybe just spooked by being alone too long. I went home that night and tried to put it out of my mind, but I couldn't. A week later, I went to drop off the inspection report for post 117. I mentioned the cabin needed repair, said the roof was caving in, maybe not safe to use anymore. I figured that would keep anyone else from going out there. The supervisor just nodded and stapled it to the rest of the paperwork. Later, I looked up the name of the last ranger who had been stationed there. His name was Paul Merritt. According to the files, he'd done winter duty in 2006 and had been caught in a snowstorm. Never made it back. They never found the body. Nobody ever tore down that cabin. It's still out there, in the woods, falling apart a little more each year. I think about it sometimes, about what might have been out there with me those nights. I know it wasn't a ghost or anything like that. I don't believe in that crap. But someone was out there, or something real, flesh and blood. Sometimes when I hike alone now, I still feel it, that quiet, heavy feeling in the trees, like I'm being watched. And when I set up camp, I always triple check that the door to my tent is zip tight. I don't sleep much in the woods anymore. That job was the last time I worked as a ranger. I left the Forest Service a few months later, moved back to Arizona. I still go hiking sometimes, but never too far, and never near Pine Hollow, because I know what I saw, and I know someone else was out there, waiting. It was mid-October 2023 when I finally went back. The leaves in northern Vermont were already deep red and orange, thick underfoot, the mornings sharp and cold. I hadn't seen that place in over 9 years, not since the divorce. And I hadn't even thought about it until the lawyer called me that morning in September to tell me she was gone. Her name was Erin. She passed away in a car crash near Rutland, alone. The kind of thing you read about and forget in a few seconds. The truck driver was drunk and crossed the line. That's all there was to it. Just like that, someone I once shared a home with, years of memories with, was gone. I didn't cry. I just sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the wall for a long time. Then came the paperwork. Erin never remarried. No kids. Somehow, even though the cabin was hers after the divorce, it ended up back in my name. The lawyer didn't have much to say about it, except that it was part of a will she updated not long before her death. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was nothing. But it left me with the cabin. I didn't want to go. We bought that place when we were still newly married. It sat about 10 miles off a side road past a little town called Bennington. No cell signal out there. Gravel road most of the way, narrow and surrounded by pine. We'd picked it because we wanted a quiet escape from the city, something cheap and raw. It was half-rotten even when we bought it. An old single-story log structure with a tin roof, one bedroom, a narrow porch, and a wood-burning stove that smoked more than it warmed. But it was ours back then, before everything started falling apart. When Erin and I split, she took the cabin. I never fought for it. It just reminded me of too many things I didn't want to think about. That last winter together, there was full of silence and cold air between us. After the divorce, I moved to Pennsylvania and did my best to start over. But now she was dead, and the cabin was mine again. I don't know what made me go. Maybe I wanted closure. Maybe I just didn't want someone else going through our stuff. Or maybe I just didn't want to be scared of it anymore. I packed light. A backpack, some food, sleeping bag, a .38 revolver I kept in the lockbox, and a bottle of whiskey I hadn't touched in over a year. I left early on a Thursday morning. The drive up was long and gray, clouds sitting low over the hills. By the time I reached the gravel road leading to the cabin, it was almost 4 p.m. The sun was low. A few deer crossed in front of my truck as I drove. It was almost too quiet out there, like the whole forest was holding its breath. When I saw the cabin again, my stomach twisted. It looked almost the same. The logs were darker now, weathered and cracked in places. The front steps were broken, sagging in the middle. Some of the tin roofing had peeled up at the edges. The windows were foggy and dirty. It looked dead, but it was still standing. I parked in the grass and just sat behind the wheel for a minute. I kept expecting to feel something big, grief maybe, or guilt, but all I felt was this numb dread, like the place was waiting for me. The front door creaked when I opened it. Inside, it smelled like mold and dry rot. The furniture was still there, the same table with the scratch marks from our dog, the same 2 chairs, same wood stove. I walked around slowly, running my fingers over the surfaces. Dust everywhere. It was like time had just stopped. The bedroom was worse. Erin's stuff was still there. Clothes in the dresser, shoes under the bed, a book on the nightstand with a bookmark still in it. A cheap mystery novel. I didn't touch anything. I built a fire in the stove using some old chopped wood stacked outside, though it was damp and smoked like hell. Then I unrolled my sleeping bag in the main room, cracked the bottle of whiskey, and sat in the same chair I used to sit in 10 years ago. I didn't turn on any lights. There was no power anyway, just the firelight flickering on the walls. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was scared of ghosts or anything, just unease. Every small creak of the cabin made me sit up. Every gust of wind outside made me pause. I kept feeling like I wasn't alone, even though I knew I was. I kept hearing things that didn't belong, soft tapping on the far wall, like nails, or footsteps on the porch that never continued. I told myself it was just old wood settling, but something felt off. Not supernatural, just human. The next day, I walked the property. The woods had grown in closer than I remembered. The trail down to the stream was nearly swallowed up with bramble. I found the old tool shed half collapsed, but the axe and shovel were still inside, rusted over. The rain started in the afternoon, so I headed back early. That night was worse. Around 1 a.m., I heard the front door creak. I sat up fast, my hand going for the revolver. I stared at the door. It hadn't opened. I waited a long time, ears straining. The wind wasn't strong enough to do that. I told myself I'd left it loose, but when I checked it, it was still locked. Then I heard the softest crunch of footsteps outside. Right by the window. I froze, didn't breathe. The footsteps stopped. I stayed like that for what felt like an hour, my hand on the gun, eyes on the window, but nothing happened. I finally dozed off just before dawn. When I woke up, I found boot prints in the dirt just under the living room window. Not mine. Too wide, too fresh. No rain had washed them away yet. I walked the whole perimeter of the cabin. More prints near the back. Someone had been walking in circles, watching. I packed up and planned to leave that afternoon, but the truck wouldn't start. Battery was dead. I hadn't used it in hours. I popped the hood and checked the cables. Nothing obvious was wrong. No cell signal out here. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away. I started to feel that unease turn into something closer to fear. I stayed another night. I kept the fire low. Sat in the corner with my back against the wall. No lights. Gun in my lap. Around 3 a.m., I heard the window creak. Not the wind this time. A shadow passed by the outside. Then another. 2 figures. They didn't knock. They didn't speak. Just slow, careful movements around the outside walls. They knew someone was inside. They were checking. I didn't move, just watched. One stopped by the back window and pressed a hand to the glass. 5 fingers.
Bore.
Then, the hand slid down the window slowly, like they were trying to fog it up and see through. They moved on. Then I heard footsteps on the roof. Someone had climbed up. The tin creaked under their weight. Not heavy, careful. I aimed my gun up at the ceiling, as if that would help. But they didn't try to come in. They just walked to the far side, and I heard them jump down. After that, silence. I didn't sleep. I waited for dawn. When the sun came up, I stepped outside with the gun raised. The prints were everywhere, around the whole cabin. 1 set of bare feet. 1 set of boots. They circled again and again. I looked up at the roof and saw a handprint on one of the tin panels. They didn't break in. They didn't take anything. They just watched. I packed everything. Started walking down the road toward the nearest house. Took me 3 hours. I didn't tell them everything. Just that my truck died and I needed help. The guy was friendly enough. Gave me a jump and I got out of there fast. I haven't been back since. I sold the cabin the following month. Dirt cheap. Didn't even care about the money. I didn't tell the new owner anything except that it hadn't been used much in the past few years. I still think about that hand on the window sometimes, and how Erin left the place to me, like she wanted me to go back one last time. Maybe she knew something. Maybe she saw something in the last few years. Or maybe she just wanted to pass the burden off before she died. Either way, I'm done with that place. I don't go into the woods anymore. I don't sleep well in unfamiliar places. And I never ignore strange sounds at night. Not anymore. It was the fall of 2013 when I decided to take a solo hunting trip deep into the Bitterroot Mountains of western Montana. I had just turned 32, living alone in Missoula after a rough breakup and spending too much time indoors. I needed something to clear my head, something far away from phones, traffic, and people. My dad used to take me hunting when I was a teenager, and I remembered this one area he talked about. A high ridge above Lolo Creek where there was a small old cabin we'd used a couple times. It was probably still there, and I figured I could hike in, stay for 4 or 5 nights, hunt, and just be alone. The cabin wasn't on any marked trail, but I had a printed topo map and I remembered the route well enough. I loaded up my gear, .308 bolt action rifle, sleeping bag, propane stove, dry food, heavy coat, headlamp, and a few essentials. I left my truck off a narrow dirt road and started hiking early that first morning. It took the better part of the day to reach the ridge. The air was already crisp. Frost covered the edges of tall grass. The climb had me sweating through layers even though the temps were just above freezing. I followed a dried-up creek bed for most of it, then cut north around a series of boulders until the slope flattened out. The cabin was still standing. It looked exactly as I remembered, though more weathered now. A single-room structure made from rough pine logs, with a rusted chimney poking out the roof. The door leaned slightly, and the latch was just a bent nail looped into a crack in the frame.
No windows.
Just a small rectangle cut near the ceiling on the back wall for airflow. No insulation either. It was drafty as hell inside. I spent the first night getting settled, cleared out a few old cobwebs, patched a hole in the roof with a tarp I had, laid my sleeping bag in a corner, and boiled some water for instant noodles. That night, I sat outside under the stars with my jacket zipped all the way up, listening to the sound of wind slipping through the pine trees. It was quiet in a way you don't get closer to civilization. Not dead quiet, just untouched. The next morning, I woke up early and headed west, crossing a gully where I saw some fresh mule deer tracks. I followed them uphill through dense underbrush, moving slow and deliberate. I sat behind a rock outcrop for a few hours, glassing the tree line. Nothing showed. No movement. I stayed still, waiting. At some point, I started feeling watched. Not in any mystical way, but like I was being scoped. I didn't see anything though, and eventually I hiked back down. I kept thinking maybe it was just my nerves, or maybe a bear had picked up my scent. Nothing unusual. The second night, I tried to sleep but kept waking up. The wind was louder. Pine needles hit the roof like tiny claws. Around midnight, I heard something outside. Not an animal. Not movement in the trees either. It was the sound of pressure. Something heavy stepped near the cabin. I sat up in my bag and grabbed my rifle. I stayed quiet, not moving, just listening. I waited at least an hour, barely blinking. Eventually, nothing else came. No sound, no shape. I wrote it off again. Maybe an elk or a moose, curious about the scent of propane or human waste. Still, I kept the rifle next to me that night. The third day was foggy. Low clouds hugged the treetops, and everything felt damp and still. I hunted down toward the south side of the ridge, but had no luck. Mid-afternoon, I made my way back to the cabin early, tired, cold, and ready for a hot meal. When I stepped inside, I noticed the door had been moved. I'd looped the nail through the crack that morning, and now it hung loose, swinging open slightly. I froze and scanned the inside. Nothing looked touched at first glance. My sleeping bag was still in the corner. My bag of food was still by the wall, but my gear had been shifted. Not stolen, just slightly moved. My stove had been rotated. My headlamp was on top of my jacket, not under it. There was a trail of dirt near the door, like someone, or something, had stepped in with muddy boots. I didn't remember bringing in that much mud. I shut the door and secured it. I spent the rest of that evening just sitting inside with the rifle on my lap. I didn't eat. I didn't light the stove. I kept my ears sharp and listened to every tiny creak in the wood. No one came that night, or if they did, they didn't make a sound. On the fourth day, I didn't even go out to hunt. I decided to scout the area around the cabin instead, see if I could spot signs of someone else nearby. I found footprints heading north, not mine. Wider, deeper, heavy boots with a pattern I didn't recognize. They were recent, too, still soft around the edges in the morning frost. I followed them for maybe half a mile. They disappeared into a section of forest where the trees grew tight and the light barely came through. I lost the trail near a split boulder and circled back. That night, I did something I hadn't done before. I stacked logs inside the door, just in case. If someone pushed it open, the logs would fall and wake me up. I barely slept. Around 2 a.m., I heard the crunch of footsteps outside. Slow, one at a time. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. Closer. Then silence. A few seconds passed. The door creaked slightly, and then a loud thud. The logs I stacked had fallen. I shot up, grabbed the rifle, heart punching my ribs from the inside. I waited. No sound after that. I didn't move for what felt like an hour. My body stayed locked. Cold sweat soaked my back. At some point, I must have passed out sitting upright. Morning light came through the vent in the back wall. I checked the door. The logs were scattered. Someone had pushed it open a few inches, then left. I looked around outside. There were new footprints, again, not mine. Same boots. They led back toward the trees. I packed up my gear that morning. Fast. I didn't eat. I didn't even take down the tarp. I knew something was wrong. Someone was out there, watching, messing with me, and they weren't just passing through. I hiked down the ridge fast, only stopping once to drink from my canteen. I stuck to the same dried creek bed on the way down, constantly looking over my shoulder. At one point, a figure stepped out from behind a tree about 50 yards back. A man, just standing there, not saying a word, not moving closer. He was wearing dark clothes, maybe camo, maybe just black. Hard to tell. His face was partially covered by something. Looked like a scarf or neck gaiter. He stood still for maybe 5 seconds, then turned and walked back into the trees. I didn't chase him. I didn't try to find out who he was. I just kept going. By early afternoon, I made it back to my truck. It was untouched, but I still checked under the chassis and inside before unlocking it. I threw my pack in the back, started the engine, and drove until I hit the highway. I didn't stop until I reached Missoula. That was the last time I went hunting alone. To this day, I don't know who that man was. Maybe he lived up there off-grid. Maybe he was squatting in the woods and didn't like someone entering his area. Or maybe he was just someone twisted, out there looking for easy targets. The truth is, I don't know and I don't want to. What I do know is that he watched me. He came into that cabin when I wasn't there. He stood outside while I slept. And he knew I was alone, far from help. I've told myself 100 times that if I hadn't set those logs behind the door, he might have come in all the way that night. I never told anyone exactly where that cabin was. I never went back to find it again. For all I know, it's still there, rotting slowly into the ground. Just a hollow shell sitting in the cold wind, waiting for someone else to come stay the night. But I won't be one of them, not ever again. It was the fall of 2017 when I took a short break from work. I was 31 years old back then, living in a small flat in Bristol, England. My job at the time was stressful. Graphic design at a firm where everyone seemed tired and worn down all the time. I wasn't sleeping well, and I felt like I needed to get away from people for a while. So I borrowed my cousin's old hatchback and drove out to North Wales for a quiet weekend. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going. I just wanted some peace. I'd planned on camping in the hills not far from a small village called Lannerman Dyffryn Syriac. I'd looked at the spot online. It was surrounded by forest, not too far from some old public footpaths, and the area didn't look busy. The forecast was cold but clear. I packed a sleeping bag, small tent, a camping stove, and enough food for 3 nights. No fancy equipment. I was just gonna hike, camp, and maybe sketch a bit. By late afternoon on the first day, I had made it about 5 or 6 miles up a rough trail off a quiet road. I hadn't seen a soul since I left the car. The trail followed a river upstream, and after an hour or so of hiking through leaf-covered mud and patches of slippery stone, I spotted an old wooden structure sitting just off the path, up on a small rise under the trees. It was a cabin, or at least what was left of one. The roof looked mostly intact and the walls were still standing, but it had clearly been abandoned for a long time. Moss and ivy had grown up the sides. One of the shutters was missing, and the small front porch had collapsed on one side. The door was slightly open, hanging at an angle. I walked up to it, pushing branches out of the way as I stepped onto the soft earth in front of it. I didn't plan to stay in it. I was just curious. I like old places like that, ones forgotten by most people. When I stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was how dry it was. It smelled like dust, old wood, and leaves. The floor creaked under my boots. There was a table with one leg broken, an empty fireplace, and an old metal frame bed in the corner with no mattress. The windows were covered in grime and too dark to see through. I set my backpack down and looked around for a few minutes. On the wall near the door were some nails and what looked like a coat hook, but everything else had been stripped. No pictures, no furniture apart from the bed and table. I checked under the bed frame and in the corners, but there wasn't much. Just a few rusted bits of tin and broken wood. Still, I figured it would be a better place to sleep than outside in the cold. I had a tarp, so I swept the corner clean and set it down to sleep on. The wind was already starting to pick up outside. That night, I made a small fire in the old fireplace using dry twigs I had gathered nearby. I boiled water on the stove and made some instant noodles. It was peaceful at first, just the crackling of the fire and wind through the trees outside. The air was cold, but not freezing. I leaned against the wall, eating, not really thinking about anything. Just glad to be away from people and emails. Then I heard something. It wasn't loud, but I noticed it because it didn't match the rhythm of the wind or the trees. A sharp, scraping sound, like something dragging against wood, came from outside, just beyond the sidewall. I froze and listened. A few seconds passed. Then again, scrape, scrape, 2 quick bursts. I stood up and walked slowly to the window. I couldn't see anything through the grime. I turned off the fire on the stove, thinking maybe the light was giving me away. I didn't have a flashlight, only my phone, but I didn't want to use it yet. I waited, holding my breath. Nothing else happened. No more sounds. After about 15 minutes, I laid back down. I told myself it was probably a branch falling or rubbing against the wall. I didn't sleep well. Every time the wind made the old wood creak, I tensed up. At some point, I must have dozed off. In the morning, I went outside and walked around the cabin. I looked for prints or signs of someone walking around. The soil was soft, but I didn't find anything clear.
No boot marks.
No animal tracks. Just a broken tree limb about 10 feet from the wall. It had fallen recently, the wood still light and splintered. I figured maybe that's what I heard. That second day, I spent hiking around the area. The woods were quiet. The trees were mostly bare, and the sky was cloudy. I took some photos, sketched a little 8 by the river. When I got back to the cabin, it was late afternoon. I made a fire again and tried to relax, but I couldn't get that scraping sound out of my head. That night, around 1 in the morning, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why. I sat up and listened. Nothing at first. Then the same noise, scrape, scrape, faint but clear. This time it sounded like it came from the back wall. I stayed still. Then I heard something else. A thump, then another one. Like footsteps but soft, slow. Something moved outside. I swear I heard breathing, slow, close, just outside the cabin wall. My heart was pounding. I didn't move. I just listened, holding my breath, my ears straining. Whatever it was, it stayed for a minute or two. Then nothing. No footsteps walking away. Just silence and wind. I waited until dawn before moving. I packed my stuff quickly, too nervous to stay another night. As I walked away from the cabin, I looked back once. Something had been scratched into the wooden wall at the back. Deep grooves, fresh. For long lines, like someone had used a metal rod or knife to dig into the wood. It hadn't been there before. I didn't know what to make of it. I didn't take a picture. I just left. I hiked back to the car, constantly looking over my shoulder. The whole way down, I felt like someone was nearby, watching, but I never saw anyone. The woods were quiet. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I didn't tell anyone for a long time. Felt stupid to say. I didn't see anything. Nothing happened to me, but it changed something in me. I don't sleep easily in unfamiliar places anymore. I don't hike alone the way I used to. A few months later, I tried to look up the cabin. I searched online for old buildings near that area. I found a short blog post from some hiker who had passed by a similar structure. They said they found it creepy. The door had deep scratch marks. They thought it might have been an old hunting shelter or ranger outpost from decades ago, maybe the 50s or 60s. No record of who built it. No stories. Just silence. What gets me still is how quiet it was out there. Not just the usual quiet of nature, but an empty kind of quiet. A waiting kind, like the woods were holding something in. I've never gone back to North Wales, and I don't think I ever will. It was October of 2019 when I decided I needed a break from everything. I'd been living in London for years, stuck in a routine that never seemed to change. Wake up, go to work, come back, sleep, over and over. I was 32 back then, single, living alone in a one-bedroom flat, and I worked in IT support for a small insurance company. I started to feel like life was just passing me by. So I booked a week off, got online, and started searching for quiet places in the countryside. Somewhere I could be alone, without emails or phones or traffic. I found this old cabin on a rental site. It was tucked away in the hills of Mid-Wales, near a place called Rhaeadr. It looked decent in the photos, basic but clean. The listing said it was built in the late 1800s, but had been renovated just enough to have a functioning toilet, shower, and small kitchen.
No TV. No Wi-Fi.
Mobile signal barely existed there. Sounded perfect. I drove out on a rainy Thursday morning. It was about a 5-hour drive from London, maybe more with the rain slowing traffic. As I passed the bigger towns and the roads narrowed, everything started to feel more distant and quiet. By the time I turned onto the gravel track leading up to the cabin, I hadn't seen another car for at least half an hour. The cabin sat on the edge of a patch of woodland, surrounded by hills that rolled out into the distance. It was one of those small, dark wooden buildings with a metal roof and a narrow front porch. It looked even older than the photos had made it seem. I parked beside it, got out and listened. Nothing. No birds, no wind. Just the sound of the rain falling onto the trees and the roof. It was the kind of silence you never really get in the city. I opened the place up. The inside was simple. A single room with a wood-burning stove, a bed, a small table with 2 chairs, and a counter with a sink and a 2-ring electric hob. There was a door leading to a tiny bathroom, no more than a toilet and a cubicle shower. Everything smelled faintly of old wood and damp stone. I liked it right away. The first 2 days were exactly what I wanted, quiet. I took long walks through the woods and fields during the day and read books at night. I made simple meals, slept well, and let myself stop thinking about work. The weather stayed overcast with bursts of drizzle, but it added to the stillness of the place. It was on the 3rd night when things started to feel off. I'd gone out just before sunset to take a walk down the slope behind the cabin. There was a narrow trail that led through the woods and curved around a small hill. I wasn't planning on going far, just far enough to stretch my legs. It was about 6 p.m., and the sky was already darkening. As I came back up the trail, I glanced up toward the cabin from below. just to see the windows lit up from the outside. That's when I noticed something or someone. A figure was standing at the edge of the trees on the other side of the cabin. Not moving, not walking, just standing. It was too far to see clearly, but the shape looked like a person in a long coat or dress. I stopped. My first thought was maybe a hiker had wandered nearby, but the woods out here weren't connected to any popular walking routes. The figure didn't move. I stood still, watching. After maybe 10 seconds, it slowly backed into the tree line and disappeared. I hurried back up the trail. I felt cold all of a sudden, even though it wasn't particularly cold out. I didn't see anyone near the cabin as I approached it. I walked around the building, checked the back and sides. Nothing. I stood there, listening, but all I could hear was my own breath and the faint creaking of the trees in the wind. Back inside, I locked the door. I sat down at the table, trying to tell myself I'd imagined it. Maybe it was a tree or a shadow. Maybe it was just someone passing by. I didn't really believe that, though. It had looked like a woman. Something about the shape, thin, long limbs, the way she moved, it felt deliberate, controlled. That night, I didn't sleep much. Every creak of the old cabin made me sit up in bed. At one point, maybe around 2 a.m., I heard something soft outside, a scraping noise, like someone brushing against the wall. I stayed frozen under the blanket, not even moving. It stopped after a minute or two. I told myself again it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a fox, but my mind kept going back to the figure I saw. The next day, I didn't go for a walk. I stayed around the cabin, chopping some wood from the small stack outside and boiling water for coffee over and over just to have something to do. I kept checking the window. I didn't see anything out there, but the feeling didn't go away. I started noticing small things, too, like the pile of firewood being slightly shifted in the morning, or the faint trace of shoe prints in the mud behind the cabin. Not boots, more like thin-soled shoes, almost like slippers. By the 5th night, I was barely eating. I kept telling myself to leave, but I didn't want to seem crazy. I'd driven all this way to get away from stress, and now I was jumping at shadows like some paranoid idiot. Still, I kept the fire going late into the night and didn't turn off the lights. It was just after 3 a.m. when I heard a noise that made every hair on my body stand up. A soft knocking, not on the door, on the window. The cabin only had 2 windows, one by the bed and one near the table. The knock came from the one near the table, just a few feet from where I sat. 3 light taps, like fingernails. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just stared at the window. There was a faint shadow just outside it. Pale shape. I couldn't see a face, just the outline of a head and something long draped down like hair or cloth. The knocking came again, then silence. I didn't go near the window. I didn't want to look. I just backed slowly into the bathroom, locked the door, and sat on the closed toilet lid for hours. I didn't sleep. I waited until I could see daylight through the tiny bathroom window before I came out. When I checked the area outside the cabin later that morning, there were clear footprints in the mud, thin soles. They led around the back of the cabin to the side window and then vanished into the trees. That was it for me. I started packing. As I loaded my bag into the car, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. About 20 feet away from the cabin, hidden behind a clump of trees, was a small pile of rocks, like someone had built a marker. On top of it, laid carefully, was a cracked ceramic doll's head. Just the head, dirty, weather-worn, and placed upright, facing the cabin. I don't remember getting in the car or starting the engine. I just remember driving. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, and even then I kept going until I reached Shrewsbury, where I got a room at a cheap motel for the night. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't even leave a review on the rental site. I didn't want to explain it. I just let it be. Months later, I went down a rabbit hole online trying to see if anyone else had stayed there. The listing was gone. I searched the property address. Nothing. No mention of it anywhere. The land didn't even come up on rental records. It was like the cabin had vanished. I sometimes think about that week, about the figure standing in the trees, about the tapping on the glass, about the doll's head on the stone pile. It wasn't a ghost story. It wasn't a horror movie. It was real. It happened, and I still don't have an explanation, just that I should have left sooner. It was October 2021 when I decided to spend a few days away from everyone. I was 31 then, working in Denver at a shipping warehouse, barely seeing the daylight most of the week. I hadn't taken time off in almost a year. Everything was noisy and fast. Forklifts, emails, trucks in and out, short nights, longer mornings. My back ached more than it should have at my age. My mind felt loud all the time. So I asked for a 5-day break. Nobody fought me on it. I didn't want to go to a hotel or a crowded campsite. I wanted space, quiet, something simple. I found a listing online for a basic off-grid cabin in southern Wyoming, just outside of a small place called Elkhorn. The pictures showed a square little cabin with a tin roof and a small front porch. There were cottonwoods all around it. The listing mentioned it was near an old graveyard, forgotten and used. No tourists, no internet, no power, just a wood stove, some kerosene lanterns, a spring nearby, and a big field in back. It looked perfect. I packed what I needed: cans of food, jerky, a couple water jugs, a sleeping bag, some books, a folding knife, my hatchet, and a bolt-action rifle I'd inherited from my uncle. I wasn't planning on hunting anything, but I brought it anyway. Never know with the wild. The drive took 6 hours. After Elkhorn, it was all dirt roads. Dry, cracked trails with ruts and rocks that shook my truck like it owed money. I didn't see a single person once I passed the last barn. Just fields and barbed wire and the occasional cow off in the brush. I reached the cabin in the afternoon. It was exactly as the photos showed, tiny, kind of beat up, but standing. The paint was gone from the siding. The roof had rust spots. The porch steps creaked under my boots, but the door opened fine. Inside was dry, dusty but dry. One cot in the corner, a pot-bellied stove in the middle, and a little table with a single chair. There were spider webs in the corners and a few mouse droppings near the baseboards, but nothing I hadn't seen before. I aired the place out, swept it down, and got my gear inside. I lit a lantern and let the silence take over. That first night was calm. I made a small fire in the stove, heated a can of beans, and sat with my back against the wall. There was no sound except for wind brushing past the old logs and an occasional creak from the roof. It was exactly what I needed. Dead quiet, cold air, and no one around. The next morning, I stepped out onto the porch with a tin mug of coffee. That's when I saw the graveyard. It was maybe 80 yards from the back of the cabin, tucked just past a thinned-out tree line. I hadn't noticed it the day before. There wasn't a fence around it, just a gentle rise in the land and some weather-worn markers. Some of the headstones were leaning, some broken in half, and a few had completely fallen. It wasn't big, maybe 20-30 graves at most. I walked out to it. The grass around the stones was tall, yellowed, and brittle. There was no trail, just the kind of faint path that comes from deer or time. The names on the stones were faded. A lot of them were chipped or sun-bleached. Some had no writing left at all. I found one that said, "Infant daughter, 1892. Another one read, "Calvin Morley, 1857 to 1894. Taken too soon." There were rusted iron crosses, hand-carved markers, and a few mounds where there used to be stones. It didn't feel spooky, just sad, abandoned. I spent the rest of the day stacking wood, checking the area, and reading. When the sun went down, I lit the stove again and ate in silence. No phone, no voices, just a small wind. But something started to feel off around midnight. I woke up because I thought I heard a sound outside. Not an animal. It was too regular, 3 soft thumps, spaced apart. Not loud, but just enough to pull me from sleep. I sat up and held my breath. The sound didn't come again. I figured it might have been a branch falling or something shifting in the woods, but I grabbed the flashlight and stepped onto the porch anyway. The wind had picked up a little. The trees swayed, but there was no one there. Nothing moved. I scanned the field, the graveyard in the distance, the edges of the trees. All clear. Back inside, I kept the flashlight next to me and lay back down. I didn't sleep much after that. The next day, I found something strange by the edge of the woods. There were 3 stones arranged in a small triangle, freshly placed. They were smooth river rocks, different from the ones I'd seen in the graveyard or around the cabin. They'd been set down carefully, right at the point where the path led toward the old graves. I didn't remember seeing them the day before. They looked new, not in a natural way, intentional. I knelt down and turned one over. Just a normal rock. No writing, no markings, but it felt like someone had been there recently. I checked for boot prints or tire tracks, but the ground was dry and firm. No signs of anything. I chalked it up to maybe a deer kicking things around, even though it didn't make much sense. That evening, I didn't go outside after dark. I kept the lantern burning and my rifle on the cot beside me. I heard the noise again. Same time. 3 soft thumps, spaced apart. They came from the back of the cabin this time. I didn't go out. I sat still, heart pounding, ears straining. Nothing followed. At dawn, I circled the cabin. No footprints, no scratches, nothing disturbed. But when I looked toward the graveyard, I saw something new. Another set of river rocks, this time placed in a line right across the edge of the nearest grave. I knew they weren't there before. I would have seen them. I didn't like the feeling growing in my chest. Something wasn't right. I thought about leaving, but part of me didn't want to run over nothing. I needed more than a few creepy moments to throw in the towel, so I stayed. But I didn't sleep that night. I sat with the lantern low, watching the front door and the window. I didn't light a fire. I didn't make a sound. And around 2 a.m., I saw something move. Not a shadow, not an animal, person. They stepped through the graveyard slowly, like they were moving between the stones. No flashlight, no bag, just a dark shape walking slowly among the graves. I couldn't see their face, couldn't hear their steps. They didn't come toward the cabin, just moved through the graveyard and disappeared into the trees behind it. I sat frozen, hands tight on the rifle. My mind raced. Who the hell was out here in the middle of nowhere? What were they doing near the graves? Why didn't they have a light?
I waited till morning.
As soon as the sky turned gray, I walked out to the graveyard with the rifle slung over my shoulder. The dew on the grass made my boots wet. My breath came out in clouds. I found another pattern of rocks, now formed into a circle in the middle of the graveyard. And near the edge there were footprints.
Bare footprints. No shoes.
No socks, just soles and toes pressed into the dirt. I followed them a few yards before they vanished into the underbrush. I didn't know what to make of it, but I knew I didn't want to stay another night. I packed my things, loaded the truck, and left that afternoon. The road was rough, the sky overcast, and my hands tight on the wheel the whole drive back. When I got to town, I stopped at the small gas station and asked the guy at the counter about the cabin. Just casually mentioned the graveyard and if anyone ever goes out that way. He just shrugged. "That's the old Morley place," he said. "Graveyard's been there since the 1800s. Nobody's buried out there anymore. Used to be a little church next to it, but it burned down a long time ago. Anyone still visit?" I asked. He thought for a second. "Not really. Once in a while, A local says they saw someone out there. Folks say hikers pass through, but not often. Mostly just empty now. I didn't tell him what I saw. I got home that night and unpacked. I didn't sleep much the next few days. I kept seeing that figure walking through the graveyard, slow and silent, like they belonged there more than I did. It's been almost 4 years since that trip. I haven't gone back to Wyoming. Haven't gone near any cabin that mentions a graveyard either. Sometimes, when it's real quiet late at night, I think about those rocks. How they were arranged. How someone kept changing them, like a message I couldn't read. And I think about those bare footprints. Someone was out there. I don't know who. I don't know why. But it was real. No ghost.
No monster.
Just someone. And that's what still keeps me up sometimes. It was October 2023 when I finally gave in and drove out to Grandma's old cabin in Burnt Hollow. She passed away 3 years earlier, and no one had touched the place since. My mom had sold her own house and moved to Florida, and my uncle was in prison, so it was just me left in the family who could really do anything with it. The cabin wasn't much. Everyone used to joke and call it Grandma's Crack Shack, because the porch sagged like a bad back and the roof looked like it had survived a grenade. I didn't have any warm memories of that place. She was the kind of woman who drank too much, smoked inside, and watched court shows all day. The cabin always smelled like old smoke and bleach. Still, it was technically mine now, and I was thinking about fixing it up enough to rent it out to hunters or campers. I figured I'd go out for a few days, check the structure, take measurements, and see if anything needed to be torn down completely. Maybe clean it up a bit. The cabin was in a dead spot between 2 hills, with a thick tree line all around. No cell service. No neighbors for at least a mile. Just a dirt track off Route 12 that curved around an old gravel pit, then up a steep hill with roots poking through like bones. I drove a silver Tacoma with off-road tires, so getting there wasn't a problem. Still, it felt weird to park in that spot again after all these years. I stood in front of the cabin for a long time, just staring at it. Paint peeled off in chunks. One shutter had fallen completely. The screen door hung open like a loose jaw. The window on the right side had a garbage bag taped over it from the inside. She must have busted it before she died. I didn't remember that being broken. There were beer cans littered around the porch, maybe 15 or 20, mostly rusted. Someone had been squatting there maybe months ago, not recent. Grass had started growing up around them. Inside smelled exactly how I remembered it. Stale cigarettes, mildew, a little bit of piss. I opened all the windows right away. The floor groaned under my boots. The back room, her bedroom, was still set up like she'd never left. Her old TV was still on top of the milk crate stand, and the bed was just a bare mattress with a crumpled blanket. Cigarette burns all over it. I set up my cot in the living room. The old couch had roaches crawling inside. I sprayed a whole can of Raid into it and dragged it outside. That first night, I didn't sleep much. The wind out there didn't move the same as it did back home. It rushed and stopped in strange patterns, like something was circling the cabin. At one point, around 2 or 3 a.m., I heard a thump from the back room. Not an animal, not a branch. A hard thump like someone dropped a heavy book. I went in there and looked around with my flashlight, thinking maybe a raccoon got in. Nothing, just dust and junk. The next morning, I started walking the perimeter, looking at the foundation and skirting. On the north side of the cabin, I found a shovel. Not one I brought. An old, beat-up digging shovel. It was stuck halfway into the ground, like someone had been digging and just left it there. The dirt looked disturbed, maybe 3 feet long and a foot wide, like a shallow trench. It didn't look fresh, though. The soil was dry and cracked. Could have been months old. I found a torn tarp nearby, half buried. The whole scene gave me a bad feeling, but I didn't know what to make of it. Could have been someone burying trash. Maybe a dog. I didn't dig it up. I just marked the spot in my notebook and moved on. I stayed out there for a few more days. Every night I'd hear something. Small knocks, quiet dragging sounds, a whisper of movement across the wood floor. I didn't sleep well. One night, I left the flashlight on next to my cot. Sometime before sunrise, I opened my eyes and the beam was pointed toward the back hallway, not where I left it. I thought maybe I kicked it in my sleep, but it was sitting too far away. The weirdest part was the smell. By the third day, the place started smelling different, like wet dirt and bleach mixed with something sharp. I searched for mold. I checked under the sink, behind the fridge, even under the floorboards near the front door. Nothing. But that smell wouldn't go away. Came strongest near the back room. On the fourth day, I finally started cleaning out her bedroom. I pulled the mattress off the frame and found a small hole in the floor underneath it, like someone had pried the boards up with a crowbar and then nailed them back. I didn't have a crowbar, so I used the back end of the shovel I found outside. Under the floor was a narrow crawl space, maybe 3 feet deep. I stuck my flashlight inside. There was a small plastic cooler down there, wedged between the joists. I pulled it out slowly. It was duct taped shut. I sat there on the floor for a long time just staring at it. The cooler was white with a red top, about the size of a lunchbox. I peeled the tape off one strip at a time. Inside were sealed Ziploc bags, some full of money, some full of little white chunks, wrapped in plastic wrap. Crack, meth, pills. I don't know what exactly. It smelled chemical. I counted at least 7 bags. Tens of thousands of dollars, easy. That's when it all hit me at once. The shovel, the disturbed dirt, the cooler under the floor. This wasn't just a squat spot. This place was used, maybe still being used, for drug storage. Grandma wasn't just a drinker. She was involved in something deeper. Probably in her final years, she started dealing or letting others use the place for drops. And when she died, they didn't stop. That made me sick to my stomach. I put the cooler back exactly where I found it and nailed the boards shut. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Every creak, every gust of wind made me sit up with my flashlight. I felt like I was being watched, like someone knew I found it. I planned to leave first thing in the morning. Before sunrise, I packed everything, rolled up the cot, and locked the cabin. I was about to start the truck when I noticed something on the driver's side door. A handprint, greasy, dark, bigger than mine. I didn't wait. I got in and drove without even warming the engine. 2 days later, I called the county sheriff's office and gave an anonymous tip. I said I found signs of drugs in an old structure out in Burnt Hollow and gave the address. I didn't leave my name. A week after that, I saw a short article online. Sheriff's deputies find drug paraphernalia and human remains buried near abandoned cabin. They never mentioned Grandma's name. The article said the remains were old, likely buried more than a year ago. I never went back. I sold the land for cheap to a lumber company. It's strange how things stay quiet for years, hidden in floorboards and under tarps, until you poke around just enough to wake them up. I don't know who she was involved with, and I don't want to, but that smell, that cooler, that shovel, they weren't just junk. They were warnings. Now, when people ask why I don't visit family places or keep heirlooms, I just say, some things are better left in the ground, because not everything that rots is dead. It was late October 2018. I was 34 at the time, living just outside of Missoula, Montana, and I had recently taken a break from my usual handyman work to clear my head after a long summer full of stressful jobs. I had gone through a rough patch. Some personal issues, financial stuff, the kind of thing that creeps up on you when you're not paying attention. I got a call from an older guy named Roy who I had worked with a couple of times before. He owned a few cabins up in the mountains past Lolo. He wasn't exactly friendly, but he paid cash and didn't ask many questions, which was good enough for me. He said one of his cabins needed repairs. Leaking roof, busted windows, mice getting in, stuff like that. He asked if I could head up there alone, stay for a few nights and fix it up. I didn't think much of it. I'd done remote work before. He gave me vague directions, told me where the key would be hidden, and wired me half the pay up front. I loaded up my truck with tools, a sleeping bag, canned food, a propane heater, and some basics for 3 or 4 days. No cell signal out there, but I had a map and a portable radio for emergencies. I also brought my old .22 rifle, just in case of coyotes or anything. The first part of the drive was easy, highway and dirt road. Then the last few miles were rougher, winding up through forest roads that barely looked used. It started drizzling just as I found the turnoff Roy told me about. A small path that went downhill through the trees. It was muddy, and I had to slow down to a crawl. Eventually, the trees opened up to a clearing, and there it was. The cabin sat on a slope with thick pines behind it and a wide stretch of field to the front. A narrow creek ran past the edge of the clearing. The roof was sagging on one side, and a few shingles were already missing. One window was cracked, and another had plywood nailed across it. It looked like no one had touched the place in years. The key was exactly where Roy said it'd be, taped under the back deck. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. It smelled old, like damp wood, mouse droppings, and forgotten things. The cabin wasn't big, just one main room with a wood stove in the corner, a counter with an old sink, a tiny bathroom, and a loft above with a mattress and some dusty blankets. The place creaked with every step. Most of the floorboards were warped or uneven. One wall had mold creeping up from the bottom, but overall it was fixable. I didn't waste time. I unpacked my gear, laid out my tools, set up the propane heater, and got to work sealing the worst parts of the roof before it started raining harder. That first day went by quick. I worked into the early evening and then made a fire in the stove. I heated some canned chili and sat at the small table by the window, watching the rain hit the clearing. It was quiet except for the wind and the creek. Later that night, I climbed up to the loft and crawled into my sleeping bag. The wind pushed at the cabin, and I heard mice scurrying under the floorboards. I figured I'd set some traps in the morning. I fell asleep to the sound of the rain. The second day was all about repairs. I replaced the cracked window with a sheet of acrylic I brought, added weather stripping around the door, and patched the worst sections of the roof with tar and shingles. There was a small tool shed about 50 yards behind the cabin. It was barely standing, but I found some usable wood inside and dragged it back for patching the walls. Late that afternoon, I found something weird. While checking the far corner of the cabin's exterior, down by the side facing the woods, I noticed a bunch of small holes in the wall. Not clean drill holes, but rough gouges like something had been poking or prying into the boards. There were at least 10 or 12 of them, all about 2 inches across, uneven, clustered low to the ground. At first, I thought maybe some animal had tried getting in, porcupines or raccoons or something, but it didn't look like chewing. It looked deliberate, like someone had used a tool, maybe a chisel or knife, and scraped chunks out of the siding. It gave me a weird feeling, but I brushed it off. Could have been anything. Maybe Roy had some old tenant or neighbor who messed around out here. I covered the holes with a scrap of plywood, nailed it tight, and moved on. That night, it got colder. I sat by the fire longer, read a little from an old magazine someone had left behind, then went outside to relieve myself. The rain had mostly stopped, but the ground was soggy, and a thin fog had crept in over the clearing. As I stood there in the dark, I had this strange feeling, like something was watching me. I scanned the trees but didn't see anything. Still, I went back inside faster than usual and locked the door behind me. I slept light that night. I kept waking up to noises, the wind, cracking branches. Once, I heard a thud against the side of the cabin. I sat up in my sleeping bag and held still. Nothing after that. Maybe a branch fell. I stayed awake a while listening, but eventually dozed off again. On the third day, things got worse. I went out back in the morning to check on the shed again, and I noticed fresh marks on the plywood I had used to cover the holes. New gouges, some of them deep. One had split the board. They weren't there the day before. That's when I got uneasy. This wasn't an animal. Something or someone was messing with the cabin. I circled the place, checking for footprints. The rain and mud had wiped out most signs, but near the back wall, in a drier patch under the eaves, I spotted one clear print. A boot tread, not mine. Narrower, smaller, maybe size 9 or 10. Left foot only. The rest of the prints were too smeared to follow. I went inside and loaded my rifle. I kept it close the rest of the day. I didn't leave the cabin much after that, only to grab firewood or tools from the shed. I worked faster than before, sealing up gaps and boarding weak spots. The sun never really came out that day. Stayed gray and wet. Around 4 in the afternoon, I stopped and made dinner early. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was nearby. That night was the worst. I had just put out the fire and climbed up into the loft when I heard something. Not inside, but close. A light, slow dragging sound, like something being pulled across wood. I froze. It was coming from the front porch. Then a thump. Then silence. Then again dragged thump. I grabbed the rifle and crept down the ladder, stepping as quietly as I could. The cabin was pitch black except for the faint light from the propane heater. I peeked through the window by the door. Nothing. The clearing looked empty, just the fog rolling across the grass. I stood there, heart pounding, waiting for another sound. But there was only silence. Then suddenly, 3 loud bangs against the side of the cabin, near the corner where the gouges had been. Then footsteps, fast, crunching in the wet ground, fading into the trees. I stood frozen with the rifle aimed at the door, but nothing else happened. I stayed up the whole night, sitting on the floor, staring at the window. I kept thinking, what kind of person does this? Why mess with some cabin this deep in the woods? What did they want? When daylight finally came, I went out to check. The gouged plywood had been torn halfway off the wall. 2 of the nails had been pulled out. Whoever did it used something sharp. Not an axe, it was too clean. Maybe a crowbar or blade. I checked the shed too, and that's when I noticed it. My spare fuel can was missing, one of the big red plastic ones. I had left it by the shed 2 days ago. Now it was gone. That's when I decided to pack up. I didn't care if the job was done. Roy could keep the other half of the money. I loaded everything into the truck fast. I kept the rifle slung over my shoulder the whole time. Before I left, I looked around one last time. No sign of anyone. No fresh footprints. No movement in the trees. Just that thick fog hugging the treetops. The drive back out was tense. The muddy path was even worse than before, and I kept checking my mirrors. But nothing followed. I got back to the main road by early afternoon and drove straight home. I called Roy that night from town and told him what happened. He didn't seem surprised. Just said, "All right," and hung up. I never worked for him again. Later, I looked up the area near that cabin. Found some old news stories from years back. Talk of squatters, a few break-ins, someone living off-grid in the woods that police never found. Nothing recent, but it didn't matter. Whatever it was, whoever it was, I don't think they wanted to hurt me. I think they just didn't want me there. The dragging noise, the gouges, the stolen fuel, it felt like warnings. I've done plenty of remote jobs since then, but I don't stay overnight anymore. I finish the work and leave before dark. No matter how far out, I don't sleep where I'm not welcome. That cabin's still out there, probably more broken down by now. But I'll never go back. Some places aren't haunted, they're just watched. And that's enough to keep me away. It was the fall of 2019 when I finally took a break from everything. My job, my apartment, the city noise, the people. I was 34 then, working in Minneapolis as a mechanic. Things had gotten a little too busy for me. Too much pressure from the shop. Too many nights drinking just to fall asleep. I needed out for a while. So when I saw an old Craigslist post about a remote cabin for rent just north of Duluth, I jumped on it without thinking too hard. The guy who listed it didn't ask many questions. Just gave me GPS coordinates, a code for the lockbox, and told me to pay through Venmo. I sent the money, packed up my truck, and hit the road with just enough supplies for a week. A couple cans of chili, a case of water, a camp stove, a lantern, and a sleeping bag. I left my phone on airplane mode and didn't bring anything with a screen. That was the point. The cabin was in a place called Briar Hill, about 2 hours inland from the North Shore, tucked back in thick woods near an old logging trail. I had to drive 15 miles off the paved road to reach the dirt path that led to it. That dirt road wasn't even marked. If I hadn't been watching my mileage, I would have missed it. There were no other cabins out there. No signs.
No malvaxis.
Just dense birch and pine forests and gravel under the tires. The road got narrow and rough fast. There were sections where tree limbs scraped the sides of my truck. I stopped once just to check the tires and look at the fading tire tracks ahead. I remember thinking, if I get stuck out here, there's no one coming to help me. Eventually, I saw it through the trees, a dark brown A-frame, maybe 25 feet wide at the base, with a rusty metal roof and a brick chimney on one side. The clearing it sat in wasn't much bigger than the cabin itself, surrounded on all sides by thick, uncut woods. The front porch sagged a little, but it looked solid enough. I backed my truck in beside it, turned off the engine, and listened. No wind.
No birds.
Nothing. It was dead quiet. I used the code the guy gave me to open the lockbox and get the key. The door creaked open and I stepped into the cabin. It was musty but not moldy. Inside, it was just one big room with a small wood stove in the corner, a cot with a thin mattress, a little table, and a few shelves with dusty cooking pots and canned goods I didn't trust. There were cobwebs near the rafters and a couple mouse droppings on the floor, but no signs of anything worse. I swept the place out, unrolled my sleeping bag on the cot, and opened the single window to let in some air. The view was nothing but trees. I remember thinking that night would feel peaceful, but it didn't. I made a little fire outside in a ring of rocks and heated some chili, ate sitting on the tailgate of my truck. By the time the sky turned dark, the woods had gone totally silent again. Not the kind of quiet you get in parks. This was different, thick, like the trees themselves were muffling everything. I didn't hear any crickets.
No owls.
Just the sound of my own chewing and the occasional pop of the fire. I went inside early, lit the lantern and read a little from an old paperback I brought. But I couldn't focus. I kept glancing at the window. There were no curtains, so I felt like something out there could see me, but I couldn't see it. I turned the lantern off eventually and just laid there in the dark, trying to sleep. That was when I first noticed it. The cabin made small noises, not the usual settling wood sounds either. I'd lived in old buildings. I knew those sounds. These were different, like something faint scraping against the outside wall. Slow and short like a fingertip on wood. I froze the first time I heard it, laid completely still. Came from the back side of the cabin, behind the stove. Then nothing. Maybe 10 minutes passed and I convinced myself it was a branch moving in the breeze. But there was no breeze. I didn't sleep much that first night. Every time I started to doze off, I'd hear a tiny thump or a faint step on the porch. But every time I sat up and listened, it stopped. By morning, I was tired and stiff. I stepped out into the cold air and looked around the cabin. There weren't any animal tracks in the dirt, which I found odd. No sign of deer or raccoon, just my own footprints and tire marks. I walked a few yards into the trees behind the cabin but didn't go far. I didn't want to get turned around. I spent the day chopping some wood and stacking it by the stove. I didn't have much else to do, so I explored a little along the trail that led north. It only went a few hundred feet before it became overgrown and faded. Looked like no one had driven or walked it in years. There was an old rusted tin can wedged in a tree stump and an old license plate nailed to a tree from 1996. I turned around and came back. That night, I cooked inside on the camp stove and kept the lantern low. I didn't like having the inside lit while the outside was pitch black. I shut the window and propped a pan against the sill just in case it opened again. Then I heard that noise again. This time, it wasn't at the back. It was on the roof. A soft, dragging sound, like something shifting its weight on the metal. Not heavy, but deliberate. I held my breath. It moved once, then stopped. Then again. I waited for something to fall off, but nothing did. I stood up, walked quietly to the door, opened it slowly, and stepped out onto the porch with my flashlight. I aimed the beam up at the roof. Nothing.
No branches.
No animals. Just the cold metal reflecting my light. I circled the cabin again. Still no tracks in the dirt. No sign anything had been there at all. That night, I barely slept. I laid with the flashlight in my hand and the fire burning slow. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. This time at the window. A faint tap, like a nail touching glass. I sat up, waited, listened. Then I heard a short breath, like someone exhaling near the glass. I stood up slowly and aimed the flashlight. Nothing, just the window reflecting my face. But I knew what I heard, and it wasn't mine. In the morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin again. Still no tracks, but I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A deep gouge in the wood siding near the back corner. Fresh, like something sharp had scraped it, about 3 feet off the ground. I checked the trees, the ground, even climbed up onto the roof with a step stool I found in the closet. Nothing.
No nests. No claw marks.
No animals. Just cold rust and the sound of wind finally moving through the trees. On the third day, things got worse. It started with me waking up to the front door wide open. I never forget to lock it. I remember turning the latch before bed. The fire had gone out, and the cabin was freezing. I stepped outside in my boots and checked around again. This time there were prints, but not clear ones. Just a faint shape in the dirt like someone or something had dragged a foot sideways, then stepped back. That was when I decided I wasn't staying the whole week. I packed some of my gear into the truck and decided I'd leave the next morning. I just didn't feel right. It wasn't fear exactly. It was more like I didn't belong there, like I had crossed into something I didn't understand, something that didn't want me there. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't turn on the lantern. I just laid there in the dark, trying to stay quiet. Around midnight, I heard the creak of a step on the porch, then another, then the sound of someone breathing. Long, slow breaths, right outside the door, then scratching. Not hard, just light and slow, along the door, around the frame, like fingers looking for a gap. I stayed completely still. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe for a while. It went on for maybe 10 minutes. Then it stopped. When I opened the door in the morning, there were deep marks on the wood. 5 lines, like the tips of a hand. Human height. I didn't bother eating. I threw everything in the truck, locked the cabin behind me, and drove out fast. Faster than I should have. I bounced over the dirt trail, scratched my side mirror on a branch, and didn't stop until I hit pavement. I never contacted the guy who rented it to me, never left a review, never asked for a refund. That was almost 6 years ago now. I still live in Minneapolis, still work in the same shop. Life went back to normal, but I haven't been camping since. Haven't gone into deep woods again. The weirdest part is that sometimes, maybe once every few months, I dream about that cabin. But in the dream, I'm not inside it. I'm outside, in the trees, watching myself through the window, just standing there, breathing slow, like I was never supposed to leave, like part of me never did. And every time I wake up, I check the front door, just to make sure it's still locked.